Telefoto katoa. Good afternoon, everyone. George and Shannon, you need to stand on this side so it's a nice. Make sure you're not going to trip over that. Okay. So as indicated, I'm the provost of the university, which is really the academic life. So most of the academic side of the house, the academics themselves, the faculties, research management office, and the postgrad office fall through me. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this event this evening and to the speakers for volunteering. The Feelink event series is a really important part of the university life. It's a mechanism for us to celebrate success, but also a mechanism for us to reach out to the community and share some of the knowledge both that we generate, but also that we share through inviting others into the system. Today, we're exploring one of the biggest challenges facing New Zealand's primary sector, how we balance economic growth, environmental sustainability, and social needs in the way we plan and use our land. As our urban areas continue to grow, the pressure on rural spaces intensifies, raising important questions about how we accommodate a growing population while protecting our productive land and environmental health. To start the conversation, I'm delighted to introduce one of our key growing academics, Dr. Shannon Davis. Dr. Davis specializes in urban agriculture, food landscapes, and landscape planning. She leads the Future Foodscapes for Healthscape theme at Lincoln University Center of Excellence, designing future productive landscapes, with a research focus on reintegrating productive land into urban environments. Join me in welcoming Dr. Shannon Davis.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Kay, for your introduction, and thank you, George, for coming along and talking to us tonight. How we live with and on the land has wide-ranging effects on our ecosystems and communities. And the effects of the decisions we make today are not only felt today, but will be felt for generations to come. Globally, the predominant pattern of urbanisation is extension and de-densification, where cities are growing in physical extent at a higher rate than their population growth. And often they are growing onto important land that's providing key ecosystem services and making those urban environments viable. Cities and towns in New Zealand are becoming physically larger, less dense, and are eating up the hinterlands that are providing these essential ecosystem services, a process called urban sprawl. And alongside this physical growth and land use change, we're also seeing increased rates of reverse sensitivity associated with urban expansion, legal complaints and challenges associated with incompatible land uses. The Selwyn District, being the fastest growing in the country, is today facing this critical challenge. So on the whole, New Zealand's current approach to urban growth is one which favours rural transformation and urbanisation, where the peri-urban areas change from rural to urban, which is illustrated here in this in low density greenfield urban development. We also see existing farms being planned out of the peri-urban zone. And you can see in the image here, hopefully working. This is in Rolleston, and there's a road here that you can see at the bottom that extends through the top of the farm here, with the farm just waiting to be sold once the farmer is willing to start this land. This is an image from Lincoln with productive land being fragmented by rural subdivision. and the zoning of rural residential land within that peri-urban zone. There is also a contemporary preference for what I've heard George and Darby talking about, or terming this horizontal infill densification, where houses, our very large houses, are staying the size that they are, but the plot of land is becoming smaller, which is our current strategy for densification. So Lincoln University facilitates research and education across a broad spectrum of land use related issues, impacts and opportunities. From spatial and land use planning, environmental planning and policy, urban design, freshwater management, agriculture, ecology and food, all critical components of land use planning. Our students are out in the landscape, on the farm, in the bush, working alongside communities in iwi, presenting to councils and schools, engaging with the issues across many communities. Whether it be landscape architecture, planning, agriculture, business, valuation, property management or recreation, our programs are focused on creating landscapes that support sustainable interaction between people and land. We also have lots of postgrad research happening in this space. So from modelling peri-urban ecosystem service potential to spatial land use strategies that integrate housing, nature and food production, to measuring landscape performance of peri-urban landscape networks, our staff and postgraduate students additionally undertake critical research concerning land use change. Land use change on the edges of our cities and settlements is a significant issue facing our current decision makers. I hope that I've managed to convey a small example of the range and diversity of teaching and research that Lincoln University is doing, contributing into this really critical space. And nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou.
Thanks for sharing the insights, for giving a little flavor to what it does and does not do. I think the important work that you highlight is really carrying forward, especially in our relationship with Selwyn District Council. So again, it's my pleasure to thank you for that. George, again, much appreciated. I understand that you've come out to the university quite frequently, and that your insights are shared with students, but also with our staff. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, George Sariak. George is the Senior Strategy Planner at Selwyn District Council, originally from South Wales. He's been at the forefront of helping one of New Zealand's fastest growing districts navigate the complex challenges of urban expansion and rural preservation through smart planning, zoning, and community collaboration. Today, George will share how Selwyn is addressing these tensions and what lessons we can draw in the future. Please join me in welcoming George.
That was a nice introduction, and thanks for having me back to B-Link. I did a talk last year about the work we've been doing in the strategy team at Selwyn District Council, Waikirikiri Ki Tua Future Selwyn, which is this overarching strategic direction, a kind of framework to guide decision making for Waikirikiri Selwyn. And the team are into the next phase of our work program, which is really breathing life into that strategic direction through spatial planning and our area plans. And I'm going to give you a little flavour of some of the challenges and issues that you might already be aware about and what we're facing, but kind of the response solution as well, the options that we're looking at. And we're in really early stages, so I'd be really keen to hear from anybody who has expertise or wants to share something with the team, which would be great. I'm glad it's the land use evolution rather than the revolution, because I don't have any revolutionary new ideas I could share. I wish I did. But we're going to just go through some of those pressures and tensions in Waikirikiri Selwyn. So when I thought about land use evolution, I thought a little bit more deeply about the word evolution in the context of land use change. And I had this lecturer at the university I went to in Scotland, and he always started his lectures with dictionary definitions, and always made me think about language is important and what it means. So when we think of evolution, it's a gradual process of change. It's a process, it's slow, involves some sort of change. And this made me think about the futures thinking that we do in the strategy team. We're big proponents of futures thinking, systems thinking, and using the futures cone and thinking we know the current very well. And as we get further and further out from the current, the present, there's more possibilities and more unknowns, more uncertainties and unknown unknowns. And I think this ties in really well with a really well-known Whakatauki community, which is about walking backwards into the future, because we know the past, we can look at trends of what's been happening and project how that might inform our future. And beyond just projections, carrying those past trends, thinking about the possibilities from the preposterous to the preferable, thinking about where we want our communities to go and some of the preposterous things, the things we would hate to see in the future. So Shannon showed quite a few slides trying to show some of those jarring images of rural land versus urban land and those tensions at the rural-urban interface and the boundary. So I was going to frame my talk today around inside towns and outside towns. And I chose this photo. It's of McHugh's Forest in Darfield, which is a really great space that I really recommend going to visit. Because it shows some really clear separation of land uses there at the urban-rural boundary with the plantation forest and the exotic grasslands, and then that low-density urban development there. And then just looking at this same area now with a land use map, you can see really clearly those separation of land uses along that schism of a transport corridor, where the urban and the rural meet, and then the separation of land uses. So I'm using outside towns as a bit of a catch-all term, and I've used this quite intentionally, whereas in the past we may have used the term rural. There's numerous ways that rural can be defined. Rural's typically a residual category. It's what's left over after we classify everything else. So you'll see that quote from stats. Rural areas are not defined as those areas, are defined as those areas that are not urban. So it's what is left over essentially. There's loads of different ways that we can define rural. There's the administrative way where we look at district plans, land cover, and land use. But I've taken the district plan, and it shows that we've got a huge rural area in Waikiki Selwyn. Over 98% of Waikiki Selwyn is rural based on the general rural zone in our district plan. But there's not just one rural, I think we all know that intuitively. And in landscape architecture, there's a distinction between generic and specific landscape attributes and character and its values. So there are some commonalities between what is rural, but there are also the individual landscapes as well. So using outside and inside towns is a bit of a simplification. It's another way of expressing the urban-rural dichotomy that's so deeply ingrained in planning in Aotearoa and elsewhere. So I do want to reframe that a bit through the talk today, and that's what we're trying to do at Selwyn District Council as well, is to have a perspective of an urban-rural continuum. This sees a gradient outward from a urban centre or an urban form, and it sees urban and rural as extremes of the continuum, and that there's lots of different environments and landscapes that sit on this continuum. So they're not two separate homogeneous territories, but there's this, it's a spectrum, and there's intermediate spaces on there with different urban elements and where they meet. So the peri-urban is something that Shannon talked about, and it's a space that sits on this continuum. It's a bit ambiguous, that space, but peri-urban comes from the prefix peri, so it means around, near, near to, and the word urban is obviously sizable. Densely populated areas. So peri-urban areas are influenced by urban areas, and they're also called rural urban fringe, urban rural fringe, ex-urban areas, edgelands. They've got loads of different definitions. I want to get into a little bit about peri-urban today. So Lord Kelvin famously said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And when it comes to planning and even peri-urban planning, I'm a firm believer if you can't define the peri-urban conceptually and spatially delineate or demarcate what it is, then it's very difficult to plan for that area. And things just happen to it. And it's not a planned for area because very unintentional the development that occurs there. So I think if you can name it, you can tame it. So I think it's really important that we start thinking about the peri-urban as a specific area and the role it can play and the potential that it has. So the peri-urban is conceptually, it's an imaginary location. It's got two dynamic boundaries. It's got an inner boundary at the edge of the urban area, and then it's got an outer one into the rural area that ends at some point. The inner boundary is dynamic in the sense that you can have an urban expansion, we've already talked about briefly today, and then you can have that inner boundary then has consequences on that outer boundary where the urban area extends and it becomes more highly populated or more dense. The kind of field of influence expands out as well. So it's quite difficult to demarcate or delineate the exact locations of peri-urban areas because they're so dynamic and they're changing. I do want to talk about, this is lifted from Shannon's research, sorry, it's a bit cut up on the screen. There's no specific land classification for peri-urban areas in Aotearoa at the moment, and it's challenging to define those boundaries. So a lot of research has used urban accessibility to spatially define these areas, which I'll get into next. So Stats New Zealand, they were the first to come up with a peri-urban classification through their urban accessibility geography. And accessibility, it's not, in this context, it's not about ramps and handrails. It's about the ability of population that live outside of an urban area to access the services and facilities that they need, and typically in urban areas, hospitals, doctors, GPs, etc. And geographic accessibility is often measured by drive distances. I think it's more appropriate that it should be drive times because we essentially have a time budget or go somewhere for the distances, less of a factor than the time. And basically this classifies this peri-urban area on the basis of access to urban centres. And there's varying levels of rurality, as Statins they call it, based on their closeness or remoteness to an urban centre. So the diagram, it looks like a yummy avocado, but it is actually quite a helpful diagram. It shows that there's different sort of settlement hierarchy that we see across landscapes here, with small urban areas and rural settlements located in the peri-urban area. And the peri-urban is influenced by major, large or medium urban areas. So this is essentially showing that field of influence of the urban area. I think that's everything I need to say there. So thinking about, that last quote, urban accessibility classification measures the degree of urban influence on New Zealand's urban areas that New Zealand's urban areas have on surrounding rural areas. So urban influence is a key factor on these peri-urban areas. So I want to talk a little bit now about the urban influence and the changing urbanity of Waikiki Selwyn. So this is the estimated resident population of Waikiki Selwyn, and this was a recent release a few weeks ago. We've had some new data come out, particularly from Census 2023 updates and stats updating their estimates. So it's really helpful for us to get updated data. So this incorporates the census, usually resident population, but with the post enumeration survey. That's basically the stats figure out who they overcounted or undercounted to give us a more accurate estimate of who lives where. And we now have those estimates back. So the population of Waikiki Selwyn as of June 2024 was 85,200 people. So the population's more than tripled from 25,500 in 1996. And it's doubled since 2010. That's 41,000 people. In the pandemic era, and I use the pandemic era a bit loosely here, being about, late 2019 when we heard about this virus in Wuhan, it's the Selwyn District's added another 20,000 people since June 2019 alone. So it's been exponential growth, particularly in the last few decades and even the last few years, really. So what's the components of this change, or what's causing this change? It's net internal migration, which is really interesting. That's the primary driver of growth in the Selwyn District. And that's people moving from elsewhere in Aotearoa and New Zealand. We know they're mainly moving from either Waitara, Canterbury, and they're mainly coming from Christchurch City. That's quite interesting for us. Natural increase, so that's where this has a role, but it's relatively stable. And net international migration, you can see on the slides that it goes negative 2021, 2022, and there's a bounce back. But compared to that internal migration, the numbers are absolutely massive. So taking a bit more of a lens across some of our towns, because the growth of the Selwyn District is not distributed equally. Almost 2/3 of the population live in 10% of the land area. So, and that area that is attracting the most growth is in the Greater Christchurch area, and the area that we call Eastern Selwyn, which is part of that metropolitan Greater Christchurch area. So this graph shows some of the growth of towns in Waikiki Selwyn over the last 24 years. And we can see that growth isn't distributed evenly. So Rolleston's experienced the most dramatic growth, I think you all know that. It's increased from 2,500 people roughly in the year 2000 to 33,200 people in 2024 today. So it's bigger than Timaru, bigger than Rangiora, across the path of Rangiora a couple of years ago now. And it's well on its way to being an emerging city in New Zealand's next small city. Rolleston's doubled its population from 2017, early 2017. And since 2020, so that kind of loose pandemic era, Rolleston's grown by almost 11,000 people. So almost 1 in 3 people who live in Rolleston today arrived since 2020, since 2019. Lincoln's showing the next strongest growth. So it's risen from about 2,460 people to over 12,000 residents. So it's nearly quintupled in size over this 24-year period. And Lincoln's more than doubled its population. Since 2016. So you can see those two there at the top on the graph. And West Melton is starting from a smaller base of just 210 residents in the year 2000, but it's had remarkable growth proportional to the size of the town, particularly between 2013 and 2015. The population nearly doubled from 700 to 1,700 over this period. And yeah, West Melton now at 2,500 residents, it's almost grown by 95% of the last 10 years. Prebbleton's a really interesting one, particularly because of its proximity to Christchurch. It's shown some steady growth throughout this period. It's grown by 68% in the last 10 years. It's doubled in size since 2011. I'll focus on Darfield and Leiston, those are kind of our key centres in the Malvern area and the Ellesmere area. They've experienced much more modest growth compared to the other towns, but they've still had some growth. But it's clearly, in terms of peri-urban influence of Christchurch City, there's been a lot of influence, urban influence of Christchurch City on these parts of Waikiki Selwyn. So this is a recent release from Stats NZ, and I think it just speaks to the growth of the Rolleston area. So these are all the other large urban centres. These are urban centres that have a population of 30,000 but less than 99,000. The Local Government Act defines a city as having a population of over 50,000. You can see here Rolleston's growing faster than other large urban areas, which are essentially small cities. Rolleston grew 9.57% between 2023 and 2024. So Rolleston's growing immensely compared to these other large urban centres. Rolleston's projected to reach a population of 50,000, that threshold, having city status, as early as 2047, based on our high projection scenario. But once we get all the data from Stats on their assumptions, their living arrangement assumptions and death and births and migration assumptions, we'll relook at our projections, and I'm quite confident, I think I can say this, that it'll probably reach that a lot sooner than 2047 based on past trends. So with growing urbanity in these towns in Waikiki Selwyn, there's been a key shift in housing typology changes. The data shows substantial growth, particularly from 2020. You can see a change in more apartments, townhouses, units, and other dwellings in some districts. I saw an article about that making up the share of the housing stock in Christchurch City now based on the development trends there. And it'll be a long time, I think, till Rolleston experiences that same proportion of its housing stock being more multi-unit townhouse. But it's getting there. We've definitely seen an uptick since 2020. And that's giving the town a lot more urban feel. You speak to people who initially lived in Rolleston back when it was 2,500 people rather than 33,000 people. I feel like the town's changed quite a lot and it's got a different feel about it. Anecdotally speaking. So some of these changes just on the ground here, we've gone from having 10 dwellings per hectare in Rolleston as an average, having almost 120 dwellings per hectare. So that's quite dense. And this is a 1,000 square metre site roughly. And what was one house is now going to be 6 houses. This is on Tennyson Street, not too far from the new town centre. So speaking of the new town centre, the change is evident in the data. We're boring graphs and tables have shown you I like to talk about, but I think we'll get a bit pictorial now. It's pretty palpable on the ground for people who live in the town. So this is Rolleston Reserve as it was once known, and this is the town centre now. It's a slightly different angle, but you can see that initial area has had huge development with new row of shops on Tennyson Street, a new multi-functional space, Tara Tia, for the community, and development of the reserve. So it's growing into its own from a town to an emerging city. So with intensification, population growth, not just population growth, but urbanisation as well. Our proportion of urban living is growing faster than rural living, which is a trend we see nationally and internationally. There's lots of concern about what that means for the urban areas itself, but also its urban influence, the areas surrounding these towns. And that's something that our team's been thinking about. We're starting to try and build a picture up of what this means. So a lot of our work has been baselining information, trying to get an understanding of it, rather than be able to see the trends over time, because we're just getting the data, the resolution now to start thinking about these things. So this is mapping from sensing data, the percentage of urban green space in Rolleston and Lincoln, and trying to see where we're having these new housing developments come in. It's kind of reflecting on that image that Shannon showed, where the proportion of the lot being housing or building coverage or permeable surface is a lot higher. That's what we're hearing on the ground. So we want to just test that and see, are we seeing that change over time? Is there less urban green space in our new urban areas, smaller lot sizes, and how do they get a big proportion? The answer is yes. Hand in hand with urban green space has been concern around urban tree canopy cover and the concern about the loss of urban tree cover through urban development. So tree canopy cover is the total area of the tree crown projected onto the ground as a percentage of a given area. We're taking a 3D object and trying to give it a 2D expression for them. So this chart here is some research that we just finished, and I haven't actually managed to take this to council yet, so you get a sneak peek them. It's looking at all the different towns in their open tree canopy cover from 2023 aerial and LiDAR. And we had some research shared to us through our neighbour, the Christchurch City, with their urban forest plan about what's an appropriate target for Christchurch, which extends to parts of the Selwyn District, being a grassland biome, and we're looking at around 20%. So we see some of our towns there are under the district average of 6.98%. A big block of towns that are under the 20% target, and then a few rural towns having that 20% covered. So we'll see towns that are developing quite quickly, even towns considered pretty leafy and green like Lincoln, having less than 10% covered. So this is what it looks like. We've mapped the tree canopy cover, and I'll just continue to focus on Rolleston for now, since that's what I've been presenting on. So we can see this data spatially, just like the urban green space. So we can see the distribution and see where there's deficits in particular areas, and we can assess our towns individually for deficits. So Rolleston has less than 5%, and we can see this unequal distribution. However, there are some limitations with this methodology, because the tree canopy cover, you'll see from the height class information there on the right, it starts at 3.5 metres. That's just the standard that's being used for cities in New Zealand that have done this analysis. So we're picking up the mature trees, the taller trees in all the areas of Rolleston. So we are seeing some decent landscape and planting in new areas, but it'll be a while for the survey to pick that up when it breaks that height threshold. So it's really important we keep reevaluating our urban green space and open tree canopy cover data over time. And we've been using sampling grids or like a fishnet to give us another visual perspective of that distribution of canopy cover. And you can start to kind of see, that matrix of urban space where you're seeing some green elements, some strong green elements in terms of the canopy distribution, some potential connectivity as well. So we've done some work with Marty Penwell Land Care Research, and Dan's actually hiding in the back who helped us with this, Marty, to kind of understand, well, what does urban green space on our trees mean for us that live in these towns? Like, what values and benefits do they provide to us? Because so much thinking in local government has been about when you remove a tree, it's the cost to replace it. There's so much more value for trees through the ecosystem services and also some of those intangible values, the things that you can't model or map. I proposed my wife under a tree. So there's some sentimental value as well. So it's been really good, and it's been a bit of an education piece to start to build up a picture of our urban green space, our tree canopy, and the values it provides to our towns, and what that means when we have urban development at the scale that Waikiki Selwyn has. I want to show this slide, and I showed this at my last B-Link talk because we did this in 2020 for the National Policy Statement on Highly Productive Land. We were doing what you do as planners, and it was in the planning policy space back then rather than strategy, thinking about some of the issues and the land use issues facing the district. And we did this in 2020 using data from the land cover database, and that went up to 2018, so it felt pretty up to date at the time. It's obviously largely out of date now. And we have this sense that, well, where has our urban greenfield expansion been? And is it happening on the most productive land? And whereabouts is it happening? What scale? So this research was undertaken, a while ago, and it just provides a little snippet of the expansion of the Golden Triangle of Waikiki Selwyn, really. That's Rolleston, Lincoln, and Prevelton. So we looked at the land cover change between 1996 and 2018. So it shows clearly there class 1, 2, and 3 soils, and we used a similar methodology that Stats had used using Lauer classifications for land cover. So we said what was urban. We're just showing the urban land cover change. So map 1 shows urban land cover in 1996. Map 2 shows it in 2018. Map 3 shows the net change of urban land cover between 1996 and 2018. And that map 4 just isolates what's happened on class 1, 2, and 3 soils to show the proportion that's happening on potentially most productive land. And you can see a significant portion has happened in there over that time. But we're also thinking not just about urban expansion onto greenfield land, but also like rural lifestyle development and what that meant for land fragmentation. So we're looking at these issues and challenges before we had the highly productive land national policy statement come out, and we were strong advocates for that. But I'll just go through some boring planning policy stuff to talk about some of the factors at play that have been quite challenging, I suppose, to grapple with this issue, particularly from some of the central government direction and the legislation and facing. So the growth of Waikiki Selwyn, it starts really with the Canterbury earthquake sequence, 2011. That's a huge push factor for the growth of Waikiki Selwyn. And we've seen that kind of transition because we're getting out of that rebuild phase now, and we're entering this new phase in Greater Christchurch. And we've seen a lot more pull factors for the Waikiki Selwyn. Now, people want to be there other than have nowhere else to go. So we're drawing a lot of that internal migration. A lot of people coming in, they see value and lifestyle benefits of living in Waikiki Selwyn. And also it's attracted a lot of developers who are riding the wave of that strong demand for the district. And housing affordability and availability has been an issue in the country for a long time. And I'm going to start in 2016 here with the special housing areas that are intended to deliver affordable housing for areas with a significant supply issue or affordability issue, and that included Rolleston in 2016, which was the Ackland Park subdivisions, which are on class 2 and class 3 soil. So just an example of the housing affordability and housing supply issue trumping a finite resource of soils. Issues of housing affordability and land supply drove the national policy statement on urban development capacity 2016. But this, I've skipped that out because we'll go straight to 2020 because the urban development capacity national policy statement was updated in 2020 and was given a lot more teeth. The key thing is it introduced a requirement for local authorities to be responsive to unexpected climate changes, plan change requests that would contribute to desirable outcomes, particularly for housing supply, and this was called responsive planning. So since the national policy statement for urban development 2020 is when we received the bulk of our plan change request areas being to rezone rural land to urban, and we have to consider those requests, and they've been largely granted, which has seen the exponential growth of the Selwyn District. The key thing for considering those plan change requests is significant criteria that needs to be in the regional policy statement for us to say what would significantly contribute to the supply of housing. And the significance criteria is in the draft yes, but it's not quite there yet. So there wasn't really a handbrake on some of these plan change requests coming through. We're 5 years on since the national policy statement on urban development. So it's promising that that's in the draft. It's not just the current government that's all planning and resource management. It's a bit of a barrier to getting things done, shovel-ready projects, economic development. In the COVID era, we had the Fast Track Consenting Act. This included some huge developments for Ross, in particular, Farringdon Oval, as well as Farringdon Southwest and Southeast. So it's like 2,000 lots. Well, that we're just shy of about 3 people to a household in some districts. So that's good maths, smart people. That's huge growth for the Rolleston town through that fast track process. And yeah, you know, it was a tricky time for the economy. The economy had been on pause. So that fast track had a sunset clause in it, just to kickstart things. But yeah, handbrake comes on with the national policy statement, letting through a lot of greenfield urban expansion happen. Fast track consenting also delivering that. The handbrake comes on with the national policy statement for highly productive land in 2022. Puts the handbrake on subdivision and land use, and there's been some challenges for renewable energy generation as well. And it has been tweaked, but there were some teething issues when that first came out, so it's been amended quite a lot for quite a recent piece of national direction. But there were other processes to kind of circumvent the new handbrake on development on highly productive land, which is the most recent Fast Track Approvals Act last year, and there's a couple of proposals in there for Waikiki Selwyn. That includes Birches Village and Prevelton, which comes to mind. Not too far from Carcaha Park, if you know it. And yeah, that's another means to circumvent the handbrake on urban expansion on greenfield land. We also have the current government's reform agenda, which we're looking at quite closely, and the Going for Growth housing programme, which is intended to tackle the long-standing housing shortage and affordability issues across the board too. And you can see there's this enabling greenfield. It's just cropped out enabling greenfield growth, which is kind of a prohibition on urban limits. We need to enable greenfield growth, and there's some strong direction there. And we also have some heads up coming from the Minister for Resource Management Reform that they're going to do a change to the highly productive land NPS to remove class 3. I'm not quite sure what the changes will be yet and how it will look, but there could be a quite prescriptive methodology in how we define highly productive land. So watch this space. I suppose I'm just trying to get across. It's been quite a challenging time in a regulatory sense to have some teeth to kind of encourage positive urban reform, and we're talking about growing up as well as out. We've been doing growing out really well. It's quite easy, but the growing up is quite hard. So you can grow up or growing up. I'm going to try, that's a bit doom and gloom. I'm going to try to talk about some positive stuff that the council are doing. It's around our strategic land use, growth and change, how we grapple with this and develop in the future. And these are our area plans, which are intended to essentially breathe life into Waikiki to a future Selwyn, which is that overarching strategic framework that guides all our mahi and what we're doing. So our area plans, they're non-statutory spatial plans for areas of the district. We've got 3 areas: the Malvern area, eastern Selwyn area, which is in Greater Christchurch, and the Ellesmere area. And these are intended to provide strategic and spatial direction for growth, change, development into the future. We have Ellesmere and Malvern area plans already. They were adopted in 2016, and they're intended to provide similar direction out to 2031. And these are largely out of date, need to be updated. We've got this new framework with a new set of outcomes, aspirations. So we're looking to implement those through our area plans. One thing I'll say about the area plans, just to be frank, is they have a real urban focus, and we're trying to be really intentional about our rural areas and the planning that's required there, because they're really complex areas, and it makes up so much of the district, and we'll talk about that. So we're trying to make sure that spatial planning is an urban spatial planning, the land use, the transport in terms of urban considerations, but it has a rural focus too. So these are the three areas shown spatially, and my kitty Selwyn sets out 6 strategic priorities. So these will kind of be building blocks or layers of the area plan. So we've got blue-green network, transport, housing, people and communities, our economy, and infrastructure. And if you put a rural hat on, which might be easy given the room, all 6 of those strategic priorities occur in rural environments as well as urban. So we don't have a rural strategic priority. That's a geographic area where all of these priorities matter and need to be considered. So this is a conceptual diagram of how I think the team will approach the area plan process, and it's got the urban element on there quite well, and we've been doing that and comfortable doing that, but we need a particular and considered approach to our peri-urban area. And within that peri-urban area, through the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan, there's been direction, and through some of our workshops and some of the workshops we've been doing on early engagement on the area plan, we've heard about green belts, greenways, green wedges, etc., as a means to combat that urban expansion. A lot of thought has been given to it. It's banded around as a term, but I think we need to have that conversation with our community. What a green belt looks at flat land on alluvial plains, because we don't have the topography, but a manufacturer constraint. You can't have an urban limit. So we've got to enable greenfield growth from the central government. So how could we grow up rather than out? And then we have our rest of rural area that's that outer boundary where there's the edge of the urban. So these are the areas where you consider remote rural, and that's just based on urban accessibility and land cover and some other criteria for defining peri-urban areas. So I looked at this today. I do prepare ahead of time, but I decided to look at this today as I was. It's a recent release that came out last week when I was on holiday, having a nice time, about the census data on journey to work and journey to education. This is really important for our peri-urban areas and where they are de facto. So the urban accessibility methodology from stats is based on potential accessibility. It's where could be reached, but the census data tells us where people are starting their origin and their destination. It's really interesting to see those flows and linkages with peri-urban areas that are influenced by those flows and linkages. So I've just taken as an example, and this is a really cool app, and you can explore this a bit further to see which parts of, and it's for the whole country, where people are arriving from to visit this area. So I took the I zone in Rolleston, you might know it. It's a big industrial area. It's got 2 inland ports, a lot of exciting, innovative stuff that's happening there. And it's got a lot of employment. It's one of the most job dense parts of Waikiki Selwyn, but it hasn't got many people living there. There's a few kind of caretaker accommodations there. So it's really interesting to focus on who's coming to this key employment node. There's not many people that live there. So you can see that it's pulling people from across different parts of Rolleston, but also out as far as Darfield and kind of Darfield hinterland as well as pulling people from the city. It's got Hay, which is right on the border with Templeton there. So it's pulling those parts of Western Christchurch in as well. So that's kind of its commuter sheds, its commuter catchment for that huge employment centre. So this gives us an idea of the peri-urban area for Rolleston, particularly the town. The urban accessibility methodology from stats looked at major urban centres, large urban centres and medium urban centres as being a centre of a size large enough to have that urban influence, have that urban gravitational field, as it were, And Rolleston and Lincoln have tipped into different classifications. Rolleston's a large urban centre, it's an emerging city, and Lincoln's a median urban area with a population of 12,000 now. So we need to re-look at our peri-urban areas. They're dynamic in terms of these areas are growing and their boundaries are changing. So it's a really good time, it's an opportune time to actually start to define our peri-urban area and plan for it. So I want to just talk about the idea of a green belt as an urban containment tool. It's been quite a popular term that's banded around. It's described in the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan as this area acting as a transition between urban and rural areas, and it could limit urban expansion, also address some of those other tensions you get the rural-urban interface, reverse sensitivity, protecting food-producing land, providing for green space of recreation, urban forests, wetlands, ecological restoration, all those wonderful things that people want, this kind of reframing peri-urban areas as not an area that a domino to become urban, but it could have multiple uses, multiple functionality, a lot of potential there if we just plan it. The question I often get is Rolleston, Lincoln and Springstone going to merge? And there's been a few articles about that. I'll just address the elephant in the room. There's some pretty strong, I don't have a crystal ball in my jacket pocket, but there's some pretty strong direction in the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan and in our own Waikiki Kitua Future Selwyn about preserving the feel of towns and their nature and their character and their individuality. And and you can see on the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan map down the right, the green belt is that green, that fancy green arrow that's kind of wrapping around those towns to kind of preserve their edge and to make sure they stay distinct and preserve their identity. But there's some great research that came out from the Environmental Defence Society, and they looked at green belts. It says they're an effective means of enabling towns and small villages to preserve their character, but they do not continue to expand, merge into one another. So I think we're going to be quite intentional about preserving the individuality and the character of these towns, individual towns. But not say that won't be connected in other ways. So I think that's quite an exciting opportunity for green corridors and connections. So the UK model of the green belt, which is the term that we use here, and I think we often default to that perspective. It's the idea of this green girdle, and it's shown on the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan maps in this area that wraps around the town. Often in the area contrary to where you want your greenfield growth if it is going to occur in the future. So it's essentially pushing the growth to more desirable greenfield locations. And hopefully, if you're seeking urban form change, some growing up as well with brownfield development, redevelopment, intensification. But there's more types of green belts spatially, morphologically, in terms of their form, structure, and how they function. So this is a figure ground study of London's on the left and Stockholm's on the right, and it's looking at different morphological concepts. We've got the green belt or the green girdle, as it's traditionally called. We also got green wedges, so you're thinking of like Copenhagen's five-finger plan, thinking of those green wedges that emanate out from the centre and follow corridors, typically transport corridors, which inadvertently are green corridors. And then green ways as well, which is about connecting large patches of green space, stepping stones and more linear green space. So I think we need to have that conversation with our community when they say green belt in a workshop, like what does that mean and what does that look like? And how would it work in your town, and get quite place-based and local about it. So we've been doing some really early engagement, and these ideas are coming up. So as part of our Waikiki Kitua Future Selwyn area plan work, we had the My Future Town early engagement. This sort of get community input, help shape the long-term future and aspirations for these towns. So Waikiki Kitua Future Selwyn is a broad strategic direction about having healthy, restored natural environments, having a great place to call home, right, housing, easy to get around, livable places. They're really high level aspirational, but we now need to find what that looks like in dark Lincoln, and what do people want to see for their town. So we're trying to get more place-based and specific with our area plans. So we've done this early engagement and included a few different mechanisms there. You can see the maps that were printed out and taken to events. There's also the democracy, where people are telling us what's important and what's their biggest considerations. If you have a limit of how much you spend, where do you spend it? Could we work in the real world, constraints and whatnot? We've been doing some world cafes, and that includes, they're kind of like relaxed kind of workshops where we throw some questions out there, some ideas, some challenges, and we're getting feedback from the community around some of the challenges, issues, but also some of the solutions. And what is where the green belts, the idea of green belts and riparian planting and urban forests has come up. The jewel in the crown, I suppose, has been our, well, there's two, I can't pick your favourite kid, I guess. We've done some really great youth engagement with the school, so you can see the future town design your town work. But there, essentially, this future planning, safer planning, that generation, it's Wakapuna-led thinking. So there's been some great engagement with schools. And then digitally, we've been doing our crowd map, where the community have been able to put points, lines, polygons. I've just taken a snippet of it there, and provide feedback what they want to see in their future. So I tried to find really quickly today some ones related to land use change. So I'll read them out because it's quite a small print, isn't it? It says there's far too much urban sprawl developing in the region. We need to maintain rural land as rural land and develop up the current urban areas rather than ever expanding outwards, particularly Rolleston, Lincoln, Westmoreland, Kirby, Dartford. Well, we could have named everything really. But there we are. And then the one on the right, this area seems a bad choice for housing as it floods every winter. It would be more suitable to reverting to a wetland. And there's also been conversations around flammable species around the Port Hills area and conversations about land use change. So we're starting to get that conversation with our communities about the land use change, thinking about what climate change means for these areas in the future. And we're getting some really good feedback. These crowd maps, they're just a blank base map. We haven't put anything out to elicit that feedback. This is the community coming at these maps with their ideas without anything to lead them a particular way or another. So we're starting to think about our method for how we could look at land use change. I pulled these maps together again last minute, but it's trying to tell a story of land use change. So I got all of this from the Data Supermarket, which is this open source repository of spatial data and non-spatial data about food and fibre. And it all came out of the our Land and Water National Science Challenge. And it's been really helpful for us as strategic planners to kind of look at these potential opportunities and challenges. So map one is trying to show a current challenge that's pretty topical for Waikiki Selwyn at the moment, is nitrogen susceptibility and the challenge around nitrates in waterways, in groundwater. And map 2 is an emerging challenge, and this is looking at kind of climate projection data and what this might mean. But the climate projection data just tells us whether there'll be more rain, less rain, more wind, less wind, hotter, warmer, less snow. But you need to know what does that mean in a given context. So the climate risk. So this is quite helpful when it's the thermal heat index. It looks at heat stress experienced by dairy cows. Dairy is really important by Kitty Selwyn. We're trying to think if that's a big part of our economy and a big part of our GDP, and also the identity of some communities, or what's the risk facing that in the future. What's the current risk to fresh water? What's the risk to communities and their livelihoods? And then what's the future? What's the positive? What's the future opportunity? So I just grabbed one. I went to a great presentation by the team at WSP that did the modelling for going with the grain. That's the Parliamentary Commission of the Environment's report. And they did similar work. They came up with scenarios of what could the land use change be? What does that mean in terms of the externalities, whether that be discharges, water quality, land cover, biodiversity, and what are the benefits, to look at some alternatives. So I just grabbed one, just where honey and manuka crop is suitable. So you can see there's some areas where cows might experience heat stress. There's some nitrogen leaching susceptibility there, and potentially honey and manuka might be suitable. So I think it's going to be a lot more complex than that. Like I did this in a morning, but I think it's quite an interesting data-driven way with community input to have a conversation about land use change strategically in the future. So it's important to do the quantitative modelling side. I think people are generally, in my just experience of doing this engagement, really clued up and really appreciate that and want to know what's the consequence or impact of things. But also people, I think, want to understand, well, what does that look like and how that might feel kind of exponentially as well. So this is why I think the visualization of these options is going to be really true as well. So this is some research that we kind of Selwyn District Council and also the other part of the council, the Greater Correctional Partnership, took part of this research by Monarchy Federal Land Care research about generative AI and the image creation tools. And this was a while ago now, I think it was last year, but it's kind of in social media and online, it's kind of exploded, these image creation tools recently. And they're a powerful tool, but with some limitations as well, I'm sure. But they're becoming quite, there's a lot of interest in using these as a way to communicate ideas or concepts with communities without putting loads of time and effort into drawing up pictures and then getting quite emotional and tied to your design and you don't want to give over to it. I think it's really good that we get these workshops, we can take the feedback from communities, what they want, talk about the land use, talk about land use change, what they might mean, and also try to explore how that might look. So there's a sense of how that might look on the ground. So wildfire risk on the Port Hills, a reoccurring strategic land use conversation. It's not just about radiata on the hills, but also about what natural regeneration on the hill means, particularly using nurse crops that are flammable. There's been lots of research and the plant barbecue as to flammable species and trying to think strategically about what does the land cover composition of Port Hills look like in the future and what this could mean. So this image shows some stage revegetation of Port Hills with stormwater ponds, and it shows lower flammability native species, the pine trees there, that's the baseline, the status quo, stormwater ponds come in, gravel tracks act as fire barriers, also provide access to green space for recreational amenity. So I think these tools will be really important in the strategic land use conversation about what these areas could look like. And I just think, interestingly, generative AI might be quite a powerful tool for getting that done efficiently with communities. So you can combine the modelling aspect, I think, with the visualization aspect. That's something that we took part in with land care research that did this research. So this is Prebbleton, and this is the status quo. So this is how it looks, and this is what it means in terms of some of those ecosystem services, for how much stormwater runoff's retained, how much access there is to green space, 300 metres being the World Health Organization recommendation for distance to green space, mean distance to nearest large open space, and UV protection factor. So it's largely going to be provided by tree canopy or the tree canopy. And then looking at like, okay, if we change Prebbleton in the future, if we're talking about how we grow and change Prebbleton, what does that mean? What's the consequence? What's the impact? So, and how can we do that under different options or scenarios? So a high recreational use option for Prebbleton, more sports fields, golf course, multi-use aquatic facility. You might hear there's an open day for Time Village at Prebbleton coming up. It's kind of positioning itself as this fringe Christchurch area, which could have more recreational opportunities and a great place to live and spend time and grow old. So this could be a plausible future for Prebbleton, but also there's an opportunity where we have more natural regeneration and walking trails. The cemetery would go hand in hand with Time Village, but it's in this option. But this is an alternative option. So we try to then look at, well, what does this mean in terms of the ecosystem services? So try and put a number on our future options where things could change. So this is a comparison of those two options. So slightly higher UV protection, higher recreational use, significantly higher with the revegetation. It's not some open green space, it's more enclosed through canopy. Similar for walking distance to green space, green open space, but significantly higher runoff retention in option B. So we can start to talk about, well, if we do this, this is what it means, and have that conversation with the community as to what the change means for, what the change means in terms of consequence. And there's more to just ecosystem services, but it's one option of talking about change. So we're intending to look at land use change strategically at the area plan scale, looking at individual towns and the broader area as well over this coming year and into next year. I'm actually leaving Selwyn District Council next week, so I won't be around to do the mahi. but the team will be doing this work this year and into early 2026, where we're looking to have the area plans hopefully finalised. We've done the early engagement, the idea generation, blank maps, speaking to communities, to groups, to stakeholders. I think, what do you think is important for the future? Well, there's risks, there's challenges, there's opportunities. Where can we do well? Where can we do better? What we doing right as well? What do we need to keep the same? We must be doing something right every so often. Everyone keeps moving there. So, and then we're looking at optioneering and public engagement on some options. So, okay, we've heard what you said and what you've asked for. We're trying to put some of those options back to the community to tell us what you like about option A versus option B. So there's some primitive options. And what would you take from one and the other? And maybe we'll get some hybrid Frankenstein's monster best option, which we hope to have public consultation on through that refinement process. This is the process we're going on through our land use change. And again, just to go take your minds back to that slide, this is for the urban area, the peri-urban, the green belt component, and our rural area, rather than just an urban focus. So that's everything I wanted to get through. Evolution rather than revolution, but happy to take any party now. I've also thrown up the team's email, since I'm only hanging around that Selwyn for 1 whole week. If you did have something that cropped up in the future and you wanted to get in touch. So thanks for listening. And yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I'm sure George is more than happy to. Anybody?
In terms of the development, so you're talking about needing to go up and look at those three large houses really close together, kind of garden.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's being led by developers just not really thinking that creatively? And so people, therefore, that's all they can choose to buy, which actually don't know what it would like to be in something different. So they are demanding that. And how do you break that cycle? Fundamentally, has to happen if you're going to create something different.
That's a really good question. So let's go back through all these slides. I'll try and bring up that townhouse example, because this is kind of something that's emerging. So it's a more joined up typology. It's not that calling it eaves to eaves, where they're a standalone house. It's the same product on a smaller lot. We are seeing a typology shift, and that's shown in the graph, but it is slow. I think there's path dependency. I think it's the product that has worked in these peri-urban towns of Selwyn District, and it's offering a bygone area, that half-gallon, 4-acre Pavlova paradise at scale of Selwyn District, to have a standalone house with a bit of dirt outside, but that dirt is a lot less, but you're not getting that feel of living a bit more remotely with that eaves to eaves. So I think there's a point where that's not going to work anymore, and either we're going to see a typology shift, I think, soon in Rolleston, and that might drive people further out to seek a larger area, and then you might see growth in towns outside of Rolleston. If Rolleston does take that typology shift, and all of a sudden it doesn't become much different from the offering in the city, if there's more townhouses and apartments in Rolleston in the future, unless the services and amenities and everything that people are going to Rolleston for, great parks, reserves, continues in the future. But I just think it doesn't have that point of difference if it makes the change. We want to see that urban form direction, but I think you need to see commensurate services, facilities, transport, great public transport. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know if I think it's path dependency. I think it's selling for now. I think the question will be whether we'll continue to sell, whether we'll push people further out, or Rolleston's desirable enough that people take a housing typology lifestyle change. Seeing a lot more 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom households in the future, and they'll be rattling around in 3, 4-bedroom, standalone, double garaged houses that we have, because we're aging. It's something I didn't get into today, is the focus on land use, the demographics. We've got an aging population. We were the 3rd youngest, we're now the 10th youngest, and now outside the top 10. So we're getting a lot of aging in place. So I think we're going to need different housing solutions. Yeah.
Just to clarify, for your question, your answer sounded like the market is driving what's delivered, rather than you as a strategic planner
Right.
actually directing and influencing moves. Yeah.
But it's tricky, right? So the plan, we can only enable, we can't require. In 2021, we had the Enabling Housing Amendment Act, changed the Resource Management Act, and there's more enabling framework for hopefully driving different housing typologies in New Zealand's largest urban centres. So we already had like a height of 8 metres, but every house is about 4 metres high in Wollaston. So we had an enabling framework, we don't have a requiring framework. So now that we've provided more generous setbacks, these medium density residential housing standards, you might have heard of it in the city as well with their Plan Change 14 work. It's enabling legislation and changes to district plans, not requiring. So we're still seeing similar typologies a bit more squeezed. I think if you looked at, say, European examples, and my accent will give me away, there's more requiring planning, where it says, well, actually, it's not about minimums and maximums. So you need to be within this distance or that height, or you can, essentially a penalisation of low density or unsustainable open form. We just have enabling, and I think the writing on the wall with the government about the enjoyment of property or property rights in the resource management system, I can't see there being any requiring. Developers will tell us that the market is for that product and that's what sells, and we have that conversation. I think it's maturing, particularly in Wollaston. I think with the university as well, there could be a typology change, and I think they're coming around to that. And we're seeing some intensification, even in greenfield areas, around 30 households per hectare, which is a step change for some of our towns by choice. But it's slow, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to play out in the future.
Because the air conditioning is stuffing my ears.
Oh, I should shout it a bit more.
You might have said something about high producing soils, but I suspect you didn't. And what's the guts of protecting the really good soils that took some thousands of years to develop?
Yeah.
We just let these capitalists go over every piece in ever increasing circles till you get to the mountains.
Yeah, I'd like to think not.
Yeah, but I mean, what's the point of all this planning? The planning that some joke will come along who's a big time developer and buy a dairy farm.
What would you?
And you'll say, no, you can't do it. Next year, there's headlines in the newspaper that development's going ahead.
Yeah. I take your sentiment. If anyone has a solution, I could go back to the slides where I did talk about the urban rural creep, about some of the challenges we've been facing and having some regulatory teeth to combat some of this. I'd love to hear it and pass it on to the team. Sorry, I don't have an answer to your sentiment.
The Resource Management Act, or district plans.
Yes.
Quite often, I was living in Dunedin, and there were strict rules about high class soils, whatever. And in order to, when a developer tried to build on high class soil from the Taieri, it finished up with the commissioners saying no at the council level, but then the council not having enough money to fight it in the Environment Court, and it always seemed that the developer had got the money, and so that's where the bill.
Right, money talks.
The housing development.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's what happens in other places, but unless the new legislation that the government is planning to replace the Resource Management Act, how strict do you think then, or how guiding do you think it would be?
Laser pointer is not working, but they're going for growth or housing growth. They want to enable greenfield growth, prohibit rural urban boundaries. They've got backdoors through fast track legislation. And we've got some idea that they're going to remove the class 3 soils from what they consider highly productive land. So the writing on the wall for me is that the protection of finite soils might not be a priority at the moment for this government.
Like we argue about high productive soils. We move to marshlands, we had all the market gardeners. They all shifted out because of reverse sensitivities. People testing the trial plots, it wasn't economic. They couldn't operate. So how do we balance what we consider to be those highly productive soils that no one can commercially now work on because of a whole bunch of things, but we still have this in our mind and probably correctly that we preserve them. But how do we get that balance?
Yeah.
And I thought about the development that's just to the east of us. That was a farm that was bankrupt that no one wanted. It was on the market, on their property development orders, and has developed it. So we talk about the highly productive land that it is, but no one wanted a piece of land with the ducks were governments because it was so wet. So we can argue in the hypothetical of what's highly valued land and highly productive, but if there's no use, how long do you hold it before you release it?
Yeah.
If there's no economic value within horticultural area.
I think it would be so. We know, great question, and I think that's something that I've been thinking about, and I think hopefully the team will think about in the development of the area plans. Is that there's holding space. There's probably some land use that could occupy that for the meantime, without it stopping the reversion of that land to a productive use in the future if that was financially viable, new technology innovation. Though thinking long term, it could be renewable energy generation where it's largely reversible. And there's been some tension with that national policy on highly productive land in the land use space, around the subdivision space, around using highly productive land, class 1, 2, and 3 soils as the interim definition.
You just identified some of that land next to that with the commission initially. That's a water to play low. It's a sediment soil without the intervention of 100 tractors and irrigation. It is unfortunately dirt. And so yes, innovation and technology can then change the land use of the soil, but still. But does the classification of that land change because we have technology and innovation? Or is that soil? That's right. You still the soil.
Yeah, you could take a current state, or the soil is the soil. But what I'm trying to think is going to be strategic around land use. I don't mean what's permitted in a district plan or regional planning framework in a regulatory sense, but strategic in a spatial planning, looking at options and scenario sense. You could identify that land that's not commercially viable now, productivity, to have some sort of holding land use, such as solar arrays, that can make that land profitable in the future. Well, that can make that land profitable in the meantime. It's like a meanwhile use.
I disagree. It's just
who funds. Yeah, but I agree with your point that there's a bit more nuance to what is a productive beyond the New Zealand land resource inventory. So yeah, for sure. I don't think if that strategic land use, perhaps there's interim or meanwhile land uses that could hold that space, and then it could be reevaluated because plans get reevaluated over time. So I think that would be a good way to go.
Thank you. George is going to be welcome to answer questions in the audience, but if you'll join me in thanking him for such wonderful talk. Thank you, George.
Thanks, everyone.
Feel free to enjoy the food, the drink, and please circulate amongst us. Yeah, thank you.